Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining and welcome to this Insight Hub session on corporate sustainability essentials, where we'll speak about connecting the CSRD and the CSDDD. My name is Leonel Lisboa. I'm a lawyer, a consultant, and a co-head of Learning Academy. And I have the pleasure of being your moderator today. Quick self-introduction. Additionally, just so that you know me a little bit more, I am Brazilian, and I have been a lawyer, advisor, consultant, researcher, and teacher in the field of human rights for over a decade now. And now a quick introduction considering learning for those that don't know us yet, and welcome for the first time with us here. So Learning is an international management consultancy specialized in business and human rights, and we are based here in Berlin. We advise companies on all aspects and elements of human rights and environmental due diligence, and this includes the strategy alignments and preparation for the CSRD and CSDDD. During the session today, we'll guide you through an overview of the CSRD and the CSDDD to give you a better understanding of what's required for preparation and implementation and long-term transformation of businesses. So as I told you, I am the co-head of Learning Academy. Learning Academy is our part in learning that helps clients identify and fulfill their capacity building needs. We work with companies on the development of skills, construction of knowledge, and communication of content that is needed for them to continuously improve as responsible businesses. As Learning Academy, we are helping businesses understand these new requirements that are coming from national legislation, from international standards, from the EU directives, such as these two directives that we are going to focus today. And more specifically, for the themes today, we wanted to help clients develop this better understanding of due diligence, of reporting, of transparency. As Learning Consulting and Learning Academy, we are here to help you guys comply with the requirements and also go beyond compliance to be leaders, not only followers of this process of transformation. And I am very happy because I'm here today with two of my colleagues who are legal and reporting experts. So first, you see Katharina Behrendt here. Katharina is a consultant and the head of legal at Learning. With her background as a German lawyer, she helps clients from various sectors develop and implement human rights due diligence across their value chains. Her work focuses on keeping up with regulatory developments at both national and international levels, and she leads the legal team that provides legal briefings for both internal and external audiences. And my other colleague is Maxine Bischler. Maxine is also a consultant. She's a specialist in corporate sustainability reporting and materiality assessments. She has a wealth of experience in quality analysis, benchmarking, and risk assessments. She's great at designing solutions and strategies that align with the latest international frameworks and regulations to help advance sustainability agendas. With a master's degree in human rights, she's also supporting clients developing and implementing human rights due diligence throughout their value chains. So thank you guys for joining us. Thank you all for being here. I still have some few introductory notes before we go into the substantive part of the conversation. So our Insight Hub sessions have this structure of 45 minutes. It is a webinar with our experts, and it has some interactive parts and discussions with the audiences. So we're going to have a conversation on the beginning. We have also a poll coming up, and then we go for Q&A at the end. If we run out of time to answer these questions, don't worry. We're going to be able to write the answers for them and send it to them to you guys by email with all the content of answering those questions. The webinar is being recorded and will be available and shared with you so that you can also share with your colleagues. And just a technical disclaimer, this is not per se a legal advice. So do not, we here are to interpret the text of the law with our expertise and experience, but we are not giving specifically legal advice. Okay, so we all have seen this increasing development of domestic, European, and international regulations and standards on human rights and responsible business in the recent years. And sometimes it can seem a little bit overwhelming, right? But that is exactly what we are here to support you with. So we're going to focus today on these two directives, as I mentioned. So we have the European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that we call CSRD, and we have the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD. We're going to have questions that are going to pop up on your screen that you can choose, which is the challenge that comes up that is more relevant for you. So yeah, so you're seeing here now, you can click on any of the answers, you can click on multiple of them. And as we continue with the webinar, we're going to be collecting this. And at the end, we're going to take the most voted topics so that we talk about them. All right, so handing over to you, Katarina. Could you zoom in on these two directives and help us understand why we're focusing on them today?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. So why are we talking about the CSRD and the CSDDD today? I think we also have some slides on this topic. Exactly. So yeah, just a brief introduction about what is their main focus and how exactly are they connected. So on the left side here, you can see the CSRD, which is a European directive that imposes reporting obligation on once in full effect around 50,000 European companies. Under the CSRD, companies are required to disclose detailed sustainability topics and with that ensure transparency on ESG issues. On the other hand, on the right side, we have the CSDDD. The CSDDD requires certain European and also non-European companies to conduct mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence measures. Companies will need to do that with respect to their own operations, those of their subsidiaries, as well as those of their direct and also indirect business partners throughout their so-called chains of activities. So while the CSRD is a reporting directive that tells companies what to report on, the CSDDD is a due diligence directive which mandates how companies must act to prevent and also address human rights and environmental risks. But yeah, let's take a closer look. How exactly are those two directives connected? Legally speaking, they are connected through Article 16, Section 2 of the CSDDD. This article states that EU and non-European companies are not required to publish a separate statement under the CSDDD if they already publish a sustainability report under the CSRD. This avoids double reporting obligations for companies. Also, let's have a very quick look at the timeline. The CSRD entered into force in January 2023, well before the CSDDD did in July of this year. First, companies will have to apply the CSRD rules already this year in 2024, whereas first companies will only need to start applying the CSDDD in 2027. So what does this diverging timeline mean for companies? How are they supposed to prepare for them, for those two directives? Well, yeah, today we will speak of some synergies between the two directives that will help you prepare for both in a resource efficient and hopefully also in a meaningful way.
Great, Katarina, thank you. So these directives are kind of on transparency on one hand and adequate care in the business practice on the other hand, right? But they are quite extensive as well. So Maxine, over to you. Could you help us break down these two directives in general topics And so what do we need to think about when we are thinking about the CSRD and CSDDD in general?
Of course. So when we've been discussing the CSRD and the CSDDD, three topics stood out over and over again. And these are definitely also overlaps between the two directives and some topics where we would really recommend to put emphasis on so you can advance your strategies together. So these three topics are human rights and environmental due diligence, risk assessments, and stakeholder engagements. We will look into these topics in more detail throughout this session and how synergies can be used to advance their strategies. I would recommend to start with the topic of human rights and environmental due diligence. And as it is fundamental to the CSDDD, Katharina, could you tell us more about human rights and environmental due diligence under the directive?
Yes, of course. So the obligation to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence is the absolute core of the CSDDD. Due diligence measures for companies to identify and also address adverse human rights and environmental impacts in the sense of the CSDDD covers 6 steps. So let's quickly have a look at those steps. So the first one is integrating due diligence into policies and management systems. This should, for example, include a code of conduct describing the rules and principles to be followed throughout the company and its subsidiaries. The second step then is identifying and assessing adverse human rights and environmental impacts. And while we won't be able to, unfortunately, go into every detail of the directive and of the due diligence obligations today, the risk assessment is something that we will talk about in a little more detail. The third one then is preventing, seizing, or minimizing actual or potential adverse human rights and environmental impacts. This can, for example, include responsible contract clauses, as well as, under very certain circumstances, responsible disengagement. Another important aspect is the monitoring and assessing of the effectiveness of the measures companies have taken. The fifth one is communicating, which for most companies is covered by the CSRD, as we already talked about when it comes to Article 16, Section 2. The next step is providing remediation in case a company has actually caused or jointly caused an actual adverse impact. Further, very important aspects to consider are establishing a grievance mechanism and also engaging with stakeholder, which we will also talk about in a little bit. But Maxine, what role does due diligence play in terms of the CSRD?
So compared to the CSDDD, the CSRD does not lay out requirements due diligence as obviously. The European Sustainability Reporting Standards, or the ESRS, even state that they do not impose any conduct requirements in relation to due diligence. However, it is also clearly stated in the ESRS that the outcome of due diligence process informs the material topics for a company. And actually also, in addition to having to identify material topics under the CSRD, references to other points of due diligence processes, as you just mentioned, Katharina, are also made. So I want to focus on 2 examples. So you mentioned prevention, seizing, and minimizing impacts. Under the CSRD and in the ESRS, a company is required to disclose the actions it takes or plans to take to manage each of the material topics as part of the reporting process. This will provide information on the actions taken to prevent and mitigate impacts. As a second example, we can use point 4, monitoring effectiveness. And you can, of course, say that reporting as a whole is a monitoring exercise, which it also is. But more specifically, under the CSRD, companies need to disclose the metrics they have in place to track the effectiveness of its actions to manage each of the materials sustainability topics. And this also needs to be done regularly. So while human rights and environmental due diligence is not mandatory under the CSRD, it is clear that it is integrated throughout. And since it will become mandatory in a few years under the CSDDD, we encourage our clients and also those interested to start investing resources to implement effective due diligence measures now. So if you dedicate time to develop and align due diligence related requirements under the CSRD, you will naturally already address topics that will that you will tackle under the CSRD in a few years' times. As such, it is also beneficial to make the necessary resources available now to go forward.
Yeah, very important point, Maxine. And so we see that some questions are popping up now. Feel free to keep adding the questions. We're going to tackle them at the end. Katarina, you mentioned that we would talk a little bit more about assessments, right? So could you tell us a little bit more about that, about risk assessments?
Yes, sure, absolutely. So yeah, under the CSDDD, when we are looking on the right side again, we are assessing risks, or rather actual or adverse impacts, to use the CSDDD language. We are looking at the way that companies directly or indirectly affect rights of individuals and communities. Two key messages I would like to highlight right away. The CSDDD considers human rights and, for example, also compared to the German LKSG, a lot more environmental rights. Just to name two examples, we are looking at the prohibition of child labor, but we are also looking at the obligation to avoid and minimize adverse impact on biological diversity. The second kind of key message is that companies need to consider the entire chain of activities while applying the so-called risk-based approach. And yeah, if we take a closer look at Article 8 of the CSDDD, which is the important article here, is then we see that in order to identify and assess actual and potential adverse impacts, companies ought to undertake two different steps. So the first important step is to map your own operations, those of your subsidiaries, and also those of your business partners. In a second step, based on the results of exactly that mapping, companies should carry out an in-depth assessment in the areas where adverse impacts were identified to be most likely to occur or most severe. To do so, companies should take into account certain risk factors. These risk factors can, for example, be geographic, they can be contextual or sectoral risk factors. And yeah, just to feed that maybe also with an example, when looking at geographic risks, for example, the so-called CARA list gives a very good overview of conflict-affected and high-risk areas that can, in certain instances, indicate a higher risk for human rights violations to occur. Also, if your company operates in a high-risk sectors, such as the mining sectors, this also indicates a higher likelihood of risks to occur and also of severe risks to occur. Yeah, as you can see, also compared to the German Supply Chain Act, for example, the risk-based approach plays an absolute crucial role when it comes to conducting due diligence. This shall enable companies to really focus on potential or actual adverse impact on rights holders instead of really just wasting their resources and yeah, really just focusing on covering all their tier 1 suppliers. So yeah, here the assessment should be more meaningful, so to say. And another important aspect to note is that the identification of adverse impact should be conducted in a dynamic way and in a regular way. So keeping in mind for companies that this is supposed to be done at least every 12 months. And also very important, once adverse impacts have been identified, they shall be prioritized based on their severity and likelihood. Over to you, Maxine, to have a closer look what it means under the CSRD.
Sure. So when speaking about risk assessments under the CSRD, I think we come across one of the first challenges that was also mentioned or highlighted in the poll, which is to do with terminology. This is because the CSRD doesn't use the term risk assessment to identify material topics. Rather, it uses the term double materiality assessment, which I'm sure we've all come across. So as you may know, the two dimensions of materiality in the CSRD are impact materiality and financial materiality. And a sustainability matter needs to be assessed from both angles because it can be material either from the impact perspective, the financial perspective, or both. So what does this mean? If a topic is material from the impact perspective, it is connected to a company's actual or potential positive or negative impact on people or the environment. So let's use an example. What does an impact look like from a clothing company on garment workers in its supply chain? Or what kind of impact do companies' logistics services have on climate change? If we look at it in terms of this, in comparison to the CSRD, we refer to the actual or potential adverse impacts. So while under the CSRD, you can have both positive and negative impacts, the CSDDD only looks at the negative impacts. But that's where there is an overlap. A sustainability matter is material from a financial perspective, on the other hand, if it triggers or could expect to trigger financial effects on the company. So, for example, what type of effect do natural water shortages have on companies that produce water-intensive products, such as jeans? It is due to the concept of double materiality that when we speak about material topics in the CSRD, we refer to material positive and negative impacts, risks, and opportunities, the IROs. And when conducting a double materiality assessment, a company's entire value chain needs to be taken into scope. This is where it differs a little bit to the CSDDD. And it's important to particularly consider areas where there might be heightened impacts, risks, and opportunities based on the nature of activities, business relationships, and geographies, amongst other factors. Once a company has identified its material impacts, risks, and opportunities, it needs to report on these matters according to the disclosures in the ESRS. However, we also want to encourage companies to take the momentum after it's defined its material topics to set action plans and use these to also implement an effective human rights and environmental due diligence to not only use reporting as a tool for communication, but to also advance strategically. So where are the synergies in terms of risk assessment and double materiality assessment? There is one main element that I want to focus on here and highlight. That is that the CSDDD focuses on negative impacts, as I've mentioned, while the CSRD also requires companies to assess the good that they can do or create. As such, it goes beyond the concept of do no harm that we commonly work with, but to do good. And if you take on this mindset, you will be able to stand out amongst peers, and it will also encourage you to go beyond simply being compliant, which is key when managing the whole sphere of compliance these days.
Sorry, my mic. So yeah, and all this is something that also points out to the third element that you mentioned, like Maxime. So there are elements of all these directives that point out also to stakeholder engagement, which is key in all parts of this process. So Katarina, could you talk to us a little bit about this third topic of stakeholder engagement?
Yes, absolutely happy to make a start here. So let's take a look at the CSDDD. We have one article about stakeholder engagement, which is Article 13 here, and it says that companies must take appropriate measures to carry out effective engagement with stakeholders. This really means and emphasizes that stakeholder engagement under the CSDDD is mandatory. But yeah, what do we actually mean when we talk about stakeholder engagement? We already mentioned it a couple of times today, and there Article 3 of the CSDDD actually comes in quite handy because it gives us some guidance and lists some different types of stakeholders. And just to name a few, stakeholders are companies, employees, trade unions, and workers' representatives, consumers, and affected communities. It's very important when thinking about stakeholder engagement that this is not a one-way or top-down exercise, but should really follow a genuine interaction and dialogue, and if possible, also a long-term interaction and dialogue, which really also includes, and this is very important to mention, that it also includes providing stakeholders with relevant and comprehensive information. Companies should also pay attention to possible barriers when it comes to the engagement. Barriers, one that we also see very often actually is the language barriers, for example, for workers in the deeper supply chain. And another aspect is also to ensure that stakeholders are free from retaliation and retribution, and that this is not only being said on paper, but that this is actually implemented in practice. Interestingly, and also importantly, the recitals of the CSDDD about the stakeholder engagement also emphasize the need to pay attention to vulnerable stakeholders. One example there is our indigenous peoples. Consultations shall take place during the risk assessment, the development of preventive measures, and also corrective action plans, during a possible disengagement process, the adoption of remedial actions, and also the development of monitoring indicators. So yeah, in a nutshell, under the CSDDD, companies have to engage with stakeholders along their entire due diligence process. Yeah, Maxine, in that sense, in what sense is stakeholder engagement important in the CSRD? And how can companies make use of the engagement they have possibly already conducted for their double materiality assessment?
Yeah, that's a great question, Katharina. So similarly to the CSDDD, stakeholder engagement is also core to the CSRD. And the CSRD lists out types of stakeholder groups that should be considered and requires companies to engage with them also through various parts of the reporting process, which is similar also to the due diligence system as we've covered. But also, I would also like to ask the question, who are stakeholders under the CSRD? So there are two primary groups of stakeholders identified. Firstly, you have affected stakeholders, which include individuals or groups whose interests are or could be affected by companies' activities along its value chain. And secondly, there is a group of users of sustainability statements. This refers to rather investors, insurance undertakings, business partners, but it can also be interesting. And for example, trade unions, non-governmental organizations, and academics can also be relevant stakeholders here. In addition to these groups, the CSRD also lists employees and workers, consumers and affected communities, and suppliers as primary stakeholder groups, which are in line with the same ones that you mentioned, Katharina. One final distinction, as the environment is also a key pillar under the CSRD, it is recommended to consider nature as a silent stakeholder representing the planet, or to take into consideration when assessing environmental topics. So once all the relevant stakeholders have been identified, how should a company consider their views and interests? So as I said, stakeholder engagement should be considered throughout, but I do want to focus on the use or focus on the engaging with them in the respect of double materiality assessments. When conducting a materiality assessment, companies are expected to have dialogues with affected stakeholders. So on the one hand, this dialogue will provide companies with an understanding of the different types of realities different stakeholders face, and the different types of impacts, risks, and opportunities that can be associated to various sustainability topics. For example, the topic of health and safety may differ if you're looking at a group of office-based workers compared to logistic workers, and again, compared to garment factories, but all points should be considered if these are activities for a company. And secondly, we always encourage to also validate the results of the material topics with the stakeholders to ensure that their realities are also reflected accordingly. So we see again here that stakeholder engagement is key for both the CSDDD and the CSRD. And if we think in terms of timelines, we recommend to review the requirements of both directives in detail and to encourage you to prepare an engagement strategy that allows you to prepare for both directives. So for example, you can use the context gained during the CSRD process and the content covered with the stakeholders to prepare for the engagements under the CSDDD.
Yeah, thank you, Maxine. And this is the kind of thing that for us to deal with and for companies to deal with, it is required to have lots of internal capacity, right? And we, as Learning Academy, we help companies develop their internal capacity, right? We help by developing tailored trainings to support companies. So we help both frontline workers, management levels, and we also coach high leadership and C-level workers, C-level leaders in the companies in order to face these challenging topics. And talking about challenges, we had the poll for challenges, and I have the results here. So let me take a look. So with 55% of the votes is data collection amongst various departments and suppliers. And the second one with 32% is governance and oversight for sustainability initiatives. So can we then, yeah, Maxine, could you take up, or Katarina, I don't know who would like to take up the first data collection among various departments and suppliers, and then the second, governance.
Sure, I can start with the topic of data collection. So yeah, we commonly see this also amongst clients, but general in the discussions that have been happening, that their companies are very overwhelmed with all the data that they need to start collecting because it needs to be more granular, real time, and also throughout all, like the whole value chain, which some companies also don't have access to. So it makes it quite complicated. But to facilitate this, for us, we see it that it's crucial to align with relevant individuals, whether that is different departments within an organization or with stakeholders in the rest of the value chain. So with our clients, we often talk about challenges in the supply chain, especially when it comes to suppliers in the deeper supply chain. So we would recommend, for example, to map out your entire supply chain to ensure transparency, and then to organize trainings or collaborations with respective people to ensure that you are on the same page and that everyone is clear what type of data is required and how often it needs to be collected. And this can go vice versa. It can be about the company engaging with the stakeholders, but suppliers may also need information from the company. So all directions need to be considered. Katarina, do you want to talk a little bit about the governance challenge?
Yes, sure, absolutely. I think the governance challenge is something that we see quite a bit, and it's often definitely a starting point when it comes to implementing human rights due diligence systems. And I think, yeah, this is absolutely crucial is to have a strong governance system. And but yeah, it's sometimes can take a bit of time. And so two things that I would like to highlight is that it's very important to have responsibilities, right? I mean, we also have different directives now. So naming or setting up clear responsibilities within teams, but also when it comes to departments is very crucial. And then secondly, also the collaboration between the departments is very important, also to leverage the synergies that we just mentioned. Maybe also to mention another thing, and this was also we can already cover another challenge, is kind of the resource allocation, that this is really important to allocate enough resources and also to have strong leadership on those topics. How do you get strong leadership? Another challenge was management buy-in, right? How do you manage that? How can you do that? And what we often do and try to do is, of course, like highlight the business case, right? And if we for example, look at the CSDDD, things like civil liability will also, companies will face that. And this means that setting up a robust due diligence system and also implementing a thorough risk-based approach can help avoid sanctions and also lawsuits. Also, it's very important, we often talk about companies' reputations. That's definitely still a very important point when it comes to, for example, investors, but also consumers, because, we do see that they definitely care about those things, be it when it comes to, ESG ratings, but also to, what consumers buy. And I think that's it for the challenges. Back to you, Lionel.
Thank you, Katharina. Thank you, Maxine. So, and thank you to all that have sent questions. So we have 18 questions so far. I'm gonna try to group questions so that they can be answered. The topics can be tackled, and the ones that we do not have time for them, we're gonna answer them in written form. So you mentioned now so liabilities and possibility of sanctions, right, Katharina? So yeah, the effects of this. So there are some questions talking about this. I would like to group things together. So some questions are talking about possibilities of liability, fines, of oversight, and some other questions are talking about the connection and the relation between LKSG and the CSDDD. So if you could talk to us a little bit about this political debate in Germany now, how things are moving, and also about civil liability, what is expected on that?
Yes, sure, absolutely. I mean, of course, we are following very closely. I mean, we're sitting in Berlin and following the political debate that is going on at the moment very closely, right? There's a lot of pushback when it comes to the German LKSG, lots of very strong rhetoric there. And but what we really see is that the main effect of that, of these certain statements at the moment are that companies are just confused. We also see that, with our clients, but our main message also always to our clients is that, the reporting obligations are already here. And, we have European directives, and that also the due diligence obligations under the CSDDD are definitely coming. So, like German companies that are already applying the rules under the LKSG definitely have an advantage because they have an early start, right? So we keep, so our message is, we keep saying that, make use of exactly this and don't get too extracted by things that are for now not really clear and that go back and forth, and there's not really a clear direction there. But of course, it can be very difficult, very challenging, and we are always there and very happy to help navigate this. Another question about civil liability, we also see that this definitely causes companies to be quite nervous, especially when looking at the German market, because this is a big difference compared to the German LKSG. I mean, also under German law, there is the possibility, to be held liable, but not explicitly under the German Supply Chain Act. And yes, so the CSDDD introduces explicit civil liability to hold companies accountable for damage caused or jointly caused by failing to meet due diligence obligations. This is also introduces it's either negligent and also covers intentional causation, of course. And this is absolutely, I think, this is definitely crucial to allow victims to seek compensation for violations that they actually suffered. However, we often hear that companies fear a flood of lawsuits coming towards them, and how should they prepare? And I mean, one example, looking at the French vigilance law, for example, which already introduces liability and which has been there for a long time, this was not at all the case. And also, one other thing is to avoid civil liability, the best strategy there really is to have a robust due diligence system and following a risk-based approach that we've mentioned a couple of times already. And while we understand that companies, might be nervous, they should use the time they have to set up a robust and thorough human rights due diligence system. So, definitely start early, don't get too distracted by anything else. Yeah, I think, and again, of course, this is also something we can definitely help with. I'm also seeing the very first question with respect to CSDDD. Companies need to apply for the first time in 2027, meaning companies need to report in 2028. Yes, that's correct. So the due diligence obligations start in 2027, and then the reporting obligation is on the previous year, so 28, about 27. Yeah, back to you, Lionel.
Thank you, Katarina. We are on our final minutes, but I would like to ask another question that is common on the things that have been here on the questions that appeared to Maxine. So Maxine, one of the topics here is how can the reporting be more than just a communications tool, and how it can be just more than just a compliance thing, and also how to have meaningful engagement with stakeholders. So could you talk to us a little bit about that? And then we wrap up. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I also saw one of the questions that since the CSRD is linked in the CSDDD. And of course, I think there's a lot of worry about doing double work. But what we would really encourage is to have a mindset that CSRD is really, that it can go beyond reporting, and it's not only a management, it should be a management tool and not only a communications tool, because otherwise the exercise will be long and also use up a lot of resources. But if you look at it from the strategic angle, which aligns much more with the requirements under the CSDDD, it will really facilitate the process and preparation for both directives. And it will also really ensure that you put in place meaningful and effective measures that will tackle your material topics that you've identified. And in terms of stakeholder engagement, stakeholders should be considered throughout all steps, whether it's in relation to the due diligence system or also in terms of reporting. So you also prepare the report for your stakeholders. Of course, not all will read through the whole report because that's also lengthy. So there's also you should keep in mind the preparation of a report. Maybe there can be key messages, and it should just be clear which stakeholders are addressed in which parts of the report. But they should also be engaged with regularly, also in terms of the double materiality assessment, similar to a risk assessment or impact assessment under the CSDDD. They are key in receiving on the ground information, so that you don't only have to rely on desk-based work, and they need to complement each other. Yes, and I see that we have 1 more minute left, so I hand it back to you, Lionel.
Thank you, Maxine. So yeah, our time is up. So I would like to thank everybody that made the time to be here, and thank Katarina and thank Maxine. We're gonna get back on the unanswered questions, and we're gonna answer them on written form, and you're gonna get them by email together with a link to the recording. And don't hesitate to reaching out to us for support at legaldevelopments@learning.org. And if you'd like to be informed on future sessions, please subscribe to our monthly briefings and follow us on our LinkedIn page. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and see you on another Insight Hub. Bye-bye.